Imagine an empty room. Not large, not elegant. Just an ordinary room with stone walls and packed earth. Now imagine that room starting to fill up. First come the vessels. Then figures of metal, crafted with a precision no European had ever seen before. Bracelets, headdresses, flat discs that catch the light like mirrors. The contents rise slowly, week by week, until they reach the line a man had marked with his outstretched hand against the wall. The year was 1532. The man who made that promise was the Sapa Inca. The man receiving the payment had no intention of holding up his end of the deal. That is what happened at Cajamarca. And even though the scene sounds like the opening of an adventure story, it was actually the precise moment when an entire world came to an end. To understand that moment, you have to go back. At the start of the 16th century, the Tawantinsuyu was one of the largest empires on the planet. It stretched from what is now Colombia all the way down to northern Chile and Argentina, ran along the Pacific coast, and pushed east toward the Amazon rainforest. This was not loosely held territory. It was a complex, highly organized state with road networks that rivaled the reach of Roman roads, food storage systems distributed across the entire length of the Andes, and a system of collective labor that made it possible to move armies, build agricultural terraces on nearly vertical slopes, and raise stone temples without mortar. The Tawantinsuyu was a political structure so carefully assembled that it was hard to imagine how it could ever collapse. But empires accumulate internal fractures, and when Francisco Pizarro arrived in Andean territory in 1532, he found one that was impossible to ignore. The Inca Huayna Capac had died a few years earlier, most likely from a smallpox epidemic that had reached the continent before the Spanish themselves had. His death opened a succession dispute between two of his sons. Huáscar held Cusco and had institutional legitimacy on his side. Atahualpa commanded the northern army and had the loyalty of the empire's most capable generals. The war between them had lasted years. By the time Pizarro crossed the highlands toward Cajamarca, Atahualpa had just won. He was the new power in the Tawantinsuyu, but his victory was recent, and the empire was still fractured by the tensions of that civil war. Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 men, horses, harquebuses, and a determination that left no room for failure. He was not a curious explorer or a diplomat. He was a man who had staked everything on this expedition, and who understood power in very simple terms: who had it and how to take it from someone else. When he learned that Atahualpa was at Cajamarca, he marched toward him. The encounter took place on November 16, 1532. Atahualpa entered the plaza at Cajamarca with a procession of several thousand people, mostly servants and bearers, with almost no combat weapons. It was a display of ceremonial power. The Spanish were waiting in the buildings surrounding the plaza. A friar named Vicente de Valverde approached the Inca carrying a Bible and delivered a speech about the Christian faith and the authority of the Spanish crown. There are different versions of what happened next, none of them perfectly verifiable. What is clear is that at some point the Spanish opened fire, sent their horses into the crowd, and captured Atahualpa in the chaos. Within hours, the Sapa Inca was a prisoner, and thousands of his companions were dead or had fled. That was Cajamarca. Not a battle between armies. An ambush. From captivity, Atahualpa did what he could. He studied his captors, understood that metal was what drove them, and offered what would become the most iconic image of the Andean conquest: to fill the room where he was being held with gold, up to the height of his outstretched hand, and to fill it twice more with silver. In exchange, his freedom. The agreement was accepted, and the gold began to arrive. It came from temples in Cusco, from regional palaces, from ceremonial storehouses scattered across the empire, anthropomorphic figures, sacred ornaments, objects that had been part of rituals for generations. To the conquistadors, all of it was raw material to be melted into ingots. To the Inca, every piece had a name, a purpose, a place in the order of the world. Gold was not simply wealth, it was the sacred material above all others, tied to the sun, to the authority of the Inca, and to a cosmology that structured collective life. Handing it over was not just a payment, it was a forced transfer of meaning. The room filled. Pizarro and his men calculated that they had received one of the largest accumulations of precious metal anyone in the world had seen up to that point. And yet, in July of 1533, Atahualpa was executed. The trial they staged was a sham. He was accused of polygamy, idolatry, and treachery. He was sentenced to burn at the stake, a punishment that was commuted to strangulation when Atahualpa agreed to be baptized. He died as a Christian, according to the rite. But he died. The betrayal was political and symbolic at the same time. With Atahualpa dead, the ransom stopped being an agreement and became plunder. And the conquest stopped pretending to be a negotiation and revealed itself as what it had always been: a total takeover. The Tawantinsuyu no longer had a center of authority capable of organizing a unified resistance. The Spanish pushed toward Cusco, the imperial capital, and found a city that still held wealth that was difficult to measure. The Coricancha, the great temple dedicated to the sun, had walls lined with sheets of gold. Its gardens contained metal replicas of plants, animals, and human figures. It was one of the most significant sacred spaces anywhere in the Americas. It was sacked. What could not be carried away was destroyed or melted down. The buildings were repurposed for colonial construction. That same logic repeated itself across dozens of sites throughout Andean territory for decades to come. And it was in that context that other stories started to circulate. According to some accounts, part of the treasure that was supposed to reach Cajamarca never arrived. The shipments had been dispatched from different points across the empire before news of Atahualpa's death had spread. When that news reached them, some of those convoys may have been stopped or redirected. Who made those decisions? Where those objects might have been buried? Whether any of this actually happened? These are questions with no verifiable answers. But the memory of that possibility survived. One of the figures most closely associated with those legends is Rumiñahui, an Inca general who controlled the region around Quito and who continued to resist the Spanish militarily after Atahualpa's fall. Oral tradition and some later chronicles link him to treasures hidden in the Llanganates, an extremely rugged mountain range in the Ecuadorian Andes. According to the story, before he was captured and executed, Rumiñahui hid an enormous quantity of gold in that territory to keep it out of Spanish hands. The legend has many versions, many layers, and it has driven expeditions for centuries. What it does not have is archaeological confirmation. It belongs to a historical memory that blends documented facts with interpretation, longing, and a deep need to believe that something survived the destruction. And that need may be the most revealing thing of all. The legends about the lost treasure of the Inca did not appear out of nowhere. They grew from a real loss, massive and well documented, the systematic plundering of an entire continent. In less than a century, the political, religious, and territorial structures of the Andes were dismantled. Colonial forced labor replaced collective work. Temples were converted into churches or torn down. Centuries of accumulated knowledge in astronomy, agriculture, medicine, and social organization were largely ignored or destroyed. The idea of a hidden treasure serves as symbolic compensation. If something survived underground, then not everything was swept away. But that idea can also obscure something. The obsession with finding the physical gold, the missing convoy, the secret chamber beneath the Andes, turns the loss into a problem of location. And the deepest loss does not have that kind of solution. It is not buried somewhere waiting to be dug up. It lives in the interruptions that never healed, languages that stopped being spoken, rituals that were severed, ways of organizing land and time that were replaced by others without anyone asking permission. The treasure at Cajamarca was real. The metal figures that traveled from the far reaches of the Tawantinsuyu to a stone room actually existed. And their final destination was the fire of the smelting furnace. They did not end up in museums. They are not displayed behind glass. They were turned into bars and shipped to Spain, absorbed into an economy that had no way of understanding what it had destroyed in order to obtain them. What remained was not a hidden treasure. It was an absence shaped like a question. What might that world have become if it had not been taken apart before anyone thought to understand it?